Good morning and welcome to a live broadcast from the Broad Institute. The Broad Institute, well, when I write about it, I tend to use the shorthand that it's a genomics powerhouse. But I see today the Boston Globe describes it as a biomedical research juggernaut. It describes itself as something broader than that. It's a collaborative community for pioneering new approaches to biomedical science. I'm Carrie Goldberg, reporter for WBUR, Boston's NPR news station, and I'll be your host today. We'll be talking about a major development in the field of psychiatric disease research. Globally, hundreds of millions of people suffer from diseases like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. These diseases impose a huge burden on individuals, families, and society. And while the prevalence of these diseases has increased and is expected to keep increasing, scientific progress has largely stalled, leaving many patients dependent on treatments that were developed way back in the 50s and 60s. But scientists like those here at the Broad Institute and their collaborators all over the world are gaining important new insights into the genetic foundations of these diseases, insights that have the potential to lead to major advances in treatment. To tell you today's news and the science behind it, I'd like to introduce Eric Lander, the founding director and president of the Broad Institute. Eric was one of the leaders of the Human Genome Project, and he's long been dedicated to applying genomics to understanding the molecular basis of human biology and disease. He'll give you a preview of today's record-breaking news. Eric Lander.
Thanks so much, Carrie. On behalf of all of us here at the Broad, I want to welcome everybody in the room and everybody who's watching us online. So today we have two important announcements to make, both related to the future of psychiatric disease research. The first announcement is about an exciting paper that appears today online in the scientific journal Nature. The second announcement is about a truly visionary philanthropic commitment that I'll describe in just a moment. But first, the paper. The scientific paper is the product of a consortium of more than 300 scientists around the world, including researchers here at the Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research at the Broad Institute. Based on the analysis of more than 37,000 patients with schizophrenia and many, many more controls, the paper reports the discovery of more than 100 regions of the human genome underlying psychiatric disease. For the first time, we can start to see the underlying biological basis of the disease and to lay the foundation for understanding this disorder and eventually developing treatments. Now, to talk about how we got here, I want to introduce you to someone very special, Ed Skolnick. Ed is a scientific legend. More than 40 years ago, when he was a researcher at the National Institutes of Health, Ed helped characterize the first human cancer gene. He then went on to become the president of research at Merck Pharmaceuticals, where he led the development of breakthrough treatments for heart disease and for AIDS, and a vaccine for cervical cancer. When Ed left Merck, he came here to the Broad Institute because he had a passion for psychiatric disease, and he knew he had one more chapter in him.
I came to the Broad because I saw a revolution going on in human genetics. I knew that the single largest risk for diseases like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder was a genetic underlying risk. The time was ripe to make a real effort to find the genes that cause these diseases. The field of severe mental illness, especially schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, did not have any firm scientific underpinning. There was basically nothing known at a molecular level about what caused those diseases. When I first came to the Broad, I had approached the Stanley Medical Research Institute for some funding. They were excited to hear about my plans, and they did give us some pilot money to get the project off the ground. After about a year and a half, I wrote a vision statement for the Stanley Institute to try to increase modestly the level of funding. That vision statement was passed on to Ted Stanley, and he was so excited by that he suggested a much bigger level of funding to really expand the project. In 1982, we achieved a revolution in cancer research. We identified the first human cancer-causing gene that dramatically changed the field. I think we're at exactly the same stage now in the field of schizophrenia and severe mental illness.
Well, as Ed says, we're beginning to see a revolution in the study of psychiatric disease. I want to say this revolution could never have happened without Ed Skolnick's vision, drive, and tenacity. I don't think anyone else in the world could have accomplished what he's accomplished in moving this field forward. But this new era in psychiatric research could also never have happened without Ted Stanley. Ted has played an absolutely crucial part through his past philanthropy that created the Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research here at the Broad and has enabled research such as that reported in today's issue of Nature. And that brings me to our second announcement. Today, I am thrilled to report that Ted Stanley is committing an additional $650 million to the Stanley Center at the Broad Institute to support psychiatric disease research. This is the largest commitment ever made for psychiatric disease research and one of the largest commitments ever made for any type of psychiatric research. Together with his past contributions, this brings Ted's total contributions to psychiatric disease research here at the Broad to $825 million. I want to let Ted describe his motivations in his own words.
My wife and I started funding medical research about 25 years ago after our son was struck by mental illness in his junior year at college. The happy ending is after a couple of awful years for our son and for us, he went on to have a totally normal life in the almost 30 years since. At that point, my wife and I started funding medical research seeking treatment to get similar outcomes for the many other families where a mental illness like schizophrenia had brought the problem, but there was no treatment in sight to end it the way ours had ended, with medication solving the problem. Success has been slower than we would have hoped, but I'm happy to report the pace has picked up sharply over the past decade, both in Maryland at the Stanley Medical Research Group there and at the Broad Institute in Boston. What's been going on up in Boston has been particularly exciting. They collaborate with our scientists in Maryland and other experts in facilities around America and all over the world. They have 150 scientists right there that includes key partners from the Harvard and MIT faculties or at leading Boston hospitals, and particularly including a large group of dedicated young researchers who come to work every day focused on one cause and work long hours trying to find ways to help families dealing with mental illnesses. I'm just turning over almost all my money now and through my will, knowing with great certainty that they're the best equipped to know the best ways to spend it. So if you're a talented researcher, try to get a job at the Broad or collaborate with them. And if you're a fortunate philanthropist with money to spare, do what I'm doing and send it there. There's no place like it on mental illness research and very little like it in any medical research.
Wow. I just want to thank Ted Stanley for making this historic commitment and truly helping to lead a revolution in science. Now, this commitment's important because it signals to everyone, from young scientists to pharmaceutical companies, that the field of psychiatric disease research is at a critical inflection point. Thanks in no small part to Ted Stanley's support, scientists here at the Broad and their collaborators around the world are showing us that it's possible to begin to decode the biological basis of psychiatric disorders and to build the scientific foundations that we need to eventually move forward to real therapeutics. But we can't do this alone. It's going to take a consortium of committed supporters, including patient groups, government agencies, and private philanthropists around the world. Among the most important will be the U.S. National Institutes of Health. And so I'm particularly delighted to introduce Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, and Dr. Tom Insel, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health at the NIH, to share their thoughts about this remarkable time in science.
One of the things that's unique about mental illness is that it starts early. You're talking about disorders that 75% of the time start before age 25. These are the chronic disorders of young people.
The enormous personal cost to the individuals who are stricken by them for life, as well as their families, their loved ones, the cost to our nation in terms of the medical care required, and the economic loss is enormous.
But we're beginning to put enough pieces in place that the picture is beginning to emerge of what a disease like schizophrenia really is all about. Once we have that understanding, we can begin to get a much better approach to developing the next generation of treatments.
Mental illness is now poised to jump into this zone of really exciting progress, a molecular understanding followed by molecular therapeutics. That's where we need to go.
We've got a whole new generation of people coming into this field who are extremely well trained, know how to ask difficult questions, and they know how to attack them.
What's happening with this announcement today, with all the talent that is being brought to bear on these conditions, we are poised. And I would not have been able to say that a decade ago. We're poised for real advances here. I'm impatient. Everybody listening to these words is probably impatient as well. But that impatience is being met now with resolve. We're not just going to wring our hands, we're going to do something.
We are impatient, but let's talk about some of the progress that has been made. I'd like to introduce Steve Hyman. He's the director of the Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, and also a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor of Stem Cell and Regenerative Biology. From 2001 to 2011, he served as provost of Harvard University, and from 1996 to 2001, he served as director of the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health. He'll now tell us more about the paper that's just been published in Nature. Steve Hyman.
Thank you. First, I want to thank you all for being here, and I particularly want to thank Ted Stanley, whose commitment has inspired us all and allowed us to make important progress for people with psychiatric disorders. These disorders are the leading causes of disability worldwide in rich countries and poor countries alike. Schizophrenia, although it affects 1% of the world's population, always ranks among the top 20 causes of disability because its symptoms begin early in life, are so severe, often unremitting, and because the treatments are inadequate. In the United States, for example, there are economic burdens not only caused for families and for society alone, but we have chronic, challenging problems like homelessness. Ultimately, these severe psychiatric diseases result in a lifetime of lost potential and productivity. Unfortunately, it's been more than half a century since there's been significant progress in therapeutics to treat these disorders, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and there's never been a pharmacologic treatment for autism. The drug Thorazine was approved in 1954 as the first antipsychotic drug. Every antipsychotic drug on the market today fundamentally has the same mechanism of action. And the efficacy, the utility of these drugs for patients plateaued in the early 1960s. Attempts to improve upon this terrible state of affairs has preoccupied me since I was director of the National Institute of Mental Health. But what we've always lacked in order to make progress was insight into the molecular causes of these disorders that could help lead us to a new therapeutics. I think the time has come, in no small part due to this gift from the Stanleys. And in addition, it comes at an opportune time when we have the technologies that have allowed these clues to emerge. This is illustrated by the paper released today in Nature, in which a global collaboration used advanced and novel genomic technologies to identify 108 independent genetic loci linked to the causation of schizophrenia. These clues will now be used to understand the disease better and in the longer run to address new and useful therapeutics. In order to do this, we need not only the involvement of the brightest young people, many of whom are here today in this room, but we need global collaborations because we need to study the whole world's populations to understand these diseases, and also for a real commitment to global equity. This kind of critical mass will make all of the difference. Now, one of our collaborators who's made it possible to collect and analyze samples for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder is Christina Hultman at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. And another one of our important collaborators has been Mick O'Donovan and his colleagues at the University of Cardiff in Great Britain.
We have discovered over the years we need huge sample sizes. So we go out there, we recruit people who have the various disorders, we recruit them in large number, tens of thousands. We also recruit people who don't have the disorder, again in very large number.
We have reached at least the first goal, and that is to collect all these samples.
So we've been working hand in hand with sending DNA samples to the Stanley Centre. They've been undertaking genome analysis, and then together we've been analysing the results to make breakthroughs in schizophrenia genetics.
Of course, the next goal is to go further in our research and try to understand the pathways and the background that may lead also to new medications for the individual patient.
It's a very exciting time. We can look forward to many, many, many more discoveries.
This is such a remarkable moment. For so long, finding the biological causes of severe psychiatric disorders simply seemed beyond our grasp. Now, for the first time, we have real molecular clues, real insights into these disorders. Now, these extraordinary efforts have depended on many, many people, the collaborators you've just seen, many people in the room today, people like Thomas Lehner, who oversees the genetic programs at the NIMH and who played a big role in getting the field to this point. We would not be at this historical moment if not for the leadership of so many individuals who have buried their egos and come together to work as a team. To talk more about where the field stands today and where we are headed, I'd like to invite my colleagues, Eric Lander, whom you've already met, along with Steve McCarroll, who's the Director of Genetics Programs here at the Stanley Center and a professor in the Department of Genetics at Harvard Medical School, as well as an author on the just-released Nature paper, along with Ken Duckworth, who's the Medical Director for the National Alliance for Mental Illness, or NAMI, and an assistant clinical professor at Harvard Medical School.
Great, come join us, Steve.
Absolutely.
And let's jump right in. First question for Eric Lander. Of course, the science is fascinating, but let's talk about the money. So $650 million, correct? And as far as we know, the biggest gift to psychiatric research in history.
It certainly is. Well, it's just amazing. It's a historic commitment, and most importantly, it's a commitment for the long term. It's a commitment that involves contributions during Ted's life and a very substantial bequest to follow. And I think that's an amazingly important thing, because Ted Stanley is saying he knows this is going to take time to fully deliver on. It's going to extend, I think, a decade or two to really reach these goals. And to set aside money, to contribute money in this way, to make this kind of a commitment is a remarkable act. I think it is a signal to everyone in the field. And I hope it is taken as a signal by other philanthropists and by other agencies that it's time to come into this field again, to young scientists, that the field has really reached a turning point. So I think a gift of this magnitude is amazing, but it's also fair to say that alone, it's not going to get us all the way there. So the most important aspect of this gift is the signal it sends to everybody around the world that now's the time that we all should work together.
And just to clarify, though, it is a stream of money that
That's right. There are
continues.
contributions that Ted will make during his life, and then a very substantial bequest thereafter.
Got it. And of course, the money is important only because of what you can do with it. So I'd like to ask Steve McCarroll, what can you do with this money that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise?
Well, the Stanley's commitment will support research both within the Broad Institute Stanley Center and together with our collaborators around the world. First, we need to complete the work of genetic discovery by learning all that the human genome can teach us about the genes that influence the development of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and other disorders of the brain. Secondly, we need to go from these small openings to deep openings. We need to use these genetic leads to identify the key molecular events that drive the development of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and other illnesses. Third, as we begin to identify these key molecular events, we can develop cellular models in which we can study these events, and that'll make it possible to test potential therapies that could reshape these events to get better outcomes. And finally, we and many others will want to use these insights in this toolkit to develop new molecules that could be used to develop new treatments for patients. 30 years ago, the discovery of the first cancer genes put cancer research on a trajectory of biological insight after biological insight and a whole generation of new and effective treatments. Patients with so many kinds of cancer have so many options today that they didn't have even 10 years ago. And we're surrounded by friends and loved ones who are cured of cancer. That's the kind of future we need to create.
Got it. And just to follow up with one concrete question about the Nature paper that comes out today, maybe it could serve as an example of the kind of thing you'll be able to do. So the thing that most caught my eye about this paper is that there seems to be a suggestion that the immune system could somehow be implicated in some way in schizophrenia. What can you do with knowledge like that? Where do you go from there?
So Carrie, evolution is really good at reusing molecules and giving them different jobs in different parts of the body. Some of the genes that have jobs that we know about today in some immune cells may have other jobs in the brain that we need to work to discover. That's going to be a very important direction for deepening this work.
So it's just the very first clue then, in other words.
That's right.
Yeah, got it. And
that's right. It could mean a lot of different things.
Okay. And one other question about the paper for Steve Hyman. Do these findings, which also relate to synaptic plasticity, could they mean anything about being able to diagnose schizophrenia earlier?
This is a very hard problem, partly because schizophrenia is, as this paper shows, caused, at least in the genetic component, is caused by many hundreds of different genes. And as we've seen in all of medicine, some of the genes which contribute to schizophrenia also contribute to the cause of other illnesses. There's a lot of sharing between, for example, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Other genes are shared between schizophrenia and autism. And so a genetic test by itself will probably never be enough to make a diagnosis. However, genetic tests along with other kinds of examinations, perhaps one day brain imaging or cognitive testing, will certainly help narrow diagnoses. Now, one very important thing, however, is if we take all of the risk genes together in a sophisticated way, we can ask some questions about whether an individual may be at risk for this disorder early. Now, again, it's very important. Genes will not do this work by themselves, but genetic information together with cognitive testing, imaging, might help us begin to detect people who are developing schizophrenia in their teen years before their brains have undergone the kinds of changes, the damages to the synapses that you mentioned, that might be easier to prevent than to repair. And this will clearly give us an important clinical population for whom we can test preventive therapies, or at least therapies that can stop the disease in its track one day.
One day, yeah, that sounds
that's the key.
years
One
and
day.
years out. Yeah,
Yeah.
got it. Thank you. And Steve, another question for you. So you have this incredibly ambitious agenda that involves consortia and collaboration on a scale heretofore possibly unseen in science. How do you do that? What support do you need?
Well, I think, first of all, this gift from the Stanleys is absolutely galvanizing, along with the scientific research that, again, many people in this room and around the world have contributed to. One of the key things we need are some of the brightest minds in the world to gravitate to this problem. And I'm hoping that today's event and what follows will be a beacon that will attract those people to this important, but till now just too difficult a problem. The second thing we need is we need to, if anything, extend these global collaborations, because there are many populations around the world for whom we don't have genetic information, and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, for example, are universal. There's no country that lacks it, and the rates are pretty similar across the world, even though there are different genetic pathways there. And then finally, to repeat in some ways something that Eric has basically said, this gift shouldn't be seen to have taken care of the problem. This is a really hard problem. And what we hope is that this gift and the advances will galvanize other philanthropists, as Ted Stanley says, government agencies, other kinds of foundations to contribute to the kind of progress that we're seeing the first beginnings of today.
Got it. And Eric Lander, it seems to me that you have a very tricky messaging task here, because you're speaking to a public that is desperate for better treatments and cures for mental illness. And you're saying this is a message of hope, but it seems to be sort of distant hope. Or how do you calibrate that message?
This is very important. When scientists connect with the general public, we've got to both express the fact that there's tremendous hope and optimism that's coming from what's going on right now in psychiatric disease research, and we've got to couple it with a message of realism. But let me talk about that hope and optimism. We've gone 100 years without understanding anything about the biological basis of these diseases. 5 years ago, we didn't know a single gene related to any of these diseases, not a biological pathway. We were treating people empirically based on lucky accidental findings of a drug. That's no way to go forward. Now, over this last 5 years, we're seeing real, solid, reproducible findings, more than 100 genes for schizophrenia today, pointing to distinct pathways. Calcium channels and glutamate signaling and synaptic plasticity and these immune system genes you were talking about. This is concrete stuff. What this means is the pharmaceutical companies who left this field because they didn't have anything concrete to work on are now beginning to put their toes in the water, and I think they'll be jumping back in the water because there's something they can do. And young scientists, the smartest young scientists who decamped for cancer or other fields where they had really concrete things to work on, you can see them already saying, it's time to get into this field. It's going to be a period of breakthroughs. So Steve McCarroll said it. With cancer, it was 30 years from the discovery of the first oncogenes to a period now where we see more than 1,000 different drug candidates in development. It's going to take time. But in the grand sweep of things, if it takes a few decades to go from finally cracking open the problem, being able to look under the hood, to having a robust research community, a deep understanding of the problem, pharmaceutical companies coming in to try to compete with each other to develop effective treatments, it's frustrating that it's not here today, but we can't promise that it's going to be here this week, this year, or necessarily this decade. But is it going to happen? It is definitely going to happen. And that is a message of real optimism and yet realism.
And there's reason to hope that it'll be faster this time because the scientific toolkit is so much more powerful than it was 30 years ago.
Faster than cancer, in other words.
Well, we'll have learned from their experience.
Could be. I mean, amongst the
know.
scientists,
you can't know.
there are hopes that we might be able to do some of these things faster. And there's the chance that we won't be able to go any faster. Either way, the key thing is it's going to be happening. The momentum now is unstoppable. when a field makes this transition, you unleash so much energy. I'm with Steve. I have gleams in my eye of ways this could happen a lot faster, but I also don't want to make such promises, because even if it turns out to be a couple of decades to truly fulfill that promise of therapies, that is an amazing thing in human history. But of course, we all want it to go faster. We just don't want to promise it.
Got it. And let's return to the emptying pharmaceutical pipeline. Steve Hyman, I've heard you talk about that. Can this really make the difference in terms of bringing drug companies back into developing neuro?
I think so. I mean, the first thing to be said is that we need drug companies to be involved, because no academic institution can afford the large clinical trials that will be necessary, or frankly, none of us have the deep expertise in getting drugs registered in countries around the world that industry can accomplish. Look, industry made a, for us, tragic but rational decision that psychiatric disease was simply too hard. If you compare it to cancer, which is a very hard problem, the surgeon hands the scientist the very cells that are causing the disease. And what industry says about psychiatric disease is, look, the human brain is unique in evolution. It's very advanced, so animal models are only partly useful. The brain sits behind an opaque, bony skull. We can't reach in and take a biopsy. And anyway, even if we could, it wouldn't be so helpful, because these diseases are not caused by individual cells, but by complex circuits. Now, what we are hoping and what we're beginning to do, because we are engaging a number of companies, is to say, okay, but we actually have clues from the human genome that if we put them together and we use the right kinds of systems, and again, here we're riding on all advances in all of biology, you can be successful. And as I mentioned at the outset, these are the most disabling disorders in the world. They are common. If we can get from here to there, there will be real markets and opportunities. But the key is we've turned with this Nature paper and the kinds of results around it, what was a scientifically forbidding and featureless landscape into a landscape that now has toeholds and opportunities and glimmers of hope.
Fascinating. Question for Ken Duckworth. You're here representing a national alliance of patients and families, and we've just heard this tantalizing description of how we now are completely sure that we will get there. We just don't know exactly when. It's going to be a long haul. How do you translate this for patients and families? What does this mean for them?
Yeah, a couple of slogans that I like to use are progress in patience, hope and humility. But the truth is, the people who have these illnesses and their family members want to be part of this research collaboration. You think about industry, you think about scientists, you think about philanthropists. The patients and the family members are also a key part of this equation. And of course, their willingness to participate in research, being asked good questions. What are the functional outcomes that you care about? Work, love, school, job. I work at the Prevention Recovery of Early Psychosis Clinic at Mass Mental Health Center, and I've gotten really fabulous at saying, I don't know. All right, one of the things they teach you, if you don't know things in medical school, say, I don't know. Yeah. Well, I've become really fabulous at saying, I don't know. How long will I have to be on this medicine? Why is this medicine working? Did anything that I do cause any part of this? How is the marijuana that I'm smoking impacting my psychosis? Well, I have some ideas, I have some thoughts, but they're rooted in a framework of we don't know so many of the basic elements of this. And I think it's important to be honest about that and their participation in their own recovery. And I think the point that Ted Stanley made earlier, people do get better. So I have young guys getting better all the time, but they want to figure out, can I go off my medicine after 4 years of no psychosis? The truth is, we don't know. What is the risk you're taking? How big is that risk? The side effects of the current compounds are somewhat toxic. People don't like to take the treatments all the time. It's difficult to take the treatments. They cause weight gain, sexual dysfunction. These are things that most people don't want to have in their lives. And so it's a very humbling line of work when your tools are a human connection, relationship, and through NAMI, a sense of a community, that you're not alone. When people are visited by bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, they feel like I'm the only person that has been visited by this. And it turns out there's an enormous community all across the country that will welcome you, support you, and love you through education, advocacy, and fighting for better research.
Let me add to that even if I'm being very cautious about not trying to overpromise when the full set of therapeutics will come, what will come in a shorter term are some of those answers to the I don't knows.
Right.
I think we will be able to understand how's this medication working and what are these side effects, because you don't need to have the entire picture in place and all the new drugs in place to be able to fill that in. So I think it's really important to add that over the course of this period, there are going to be a lot of things that do have meaningful impacts on patients before we ultimately get to the world we all want to be in, where these are fully treatable disorders.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
It's heartening. So I want to ask a very quick open data question. Eric, I guess. The
Okay.
Broad is publicly committed to sharing its genetic data. What do you want to say about that?
So the Broad Institute, tracing its roots back to being the flagship of the Human Genome Project, has a deep public commitment to sharing its data. With regard to these genetic data on psychiatric disease, we are fully depositing these data in the appropriate databases that allow bona fide researchers to use those data anywhere in the world, subject to the protection of patient privacy. I think that's the really important thing to say, is that patients come first. These are the patient's data. And so subject to the protection of patient privacy, anybody with a bona fide scientific interest can use and learn from these data, because we know all the discoveries aren't going to be made here at the Broad or even part of this consortium. There are smart young researchers just coming into the field now, and they're going to have great ideas, better ideas, and we've got to make sure that everybody is empowered with this information, subject to patient privacy.
You know, Eric, that's one of the reasons that it's great for us to be here at the Broad, partly the remarkable technologies, the strengths of MIT, Harvard, and the hospitals, but it's an ethic like that that really makes a big difference. There will be many, many hundreds of genes involved in severe psychiatric disorders. And if we hide them and hide the data, burying them like a bone to dig up later, we will be impeding progress. And patients are giving us their DNA samples, they're undergoing examinations so that we can solve the problem, not so that we can get famous. And the way that we can solve the problem, one really important way, is by sharing the data with the entire world.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, it's just too big
Yeah.
to do yourself.
Yeah.
And the other thing that people here exuberantly share are the research software that they write for analyzing data, the molecular techniques and reagents for deepening these results into the biology. There's a whole community of sharing things and distributing them.
As important as any of the breakthroughs in DNA sequencing machines or other parts of molecular biology has been this just sea change in culture. The idea that you can't do this alone, we're all in this together, and that, in fact, the real achievements come from people working together and exposing their data. And I'm really proud of this generation of young scientists. Steve McCarroll is just a perfect example of it, who want to share everything they know and don't have what I think is this old-fashioned notion of, let me protect it, let me keep that secret so I can make advances. It is one of the most exciting things, and in the long run, it's more important than any other advance in science.
Beautiful. Well, to wrap up, I'd like to introduce the person who in many ways is the inspiration for Ted Stanley's philanthropy. That's his son, Jonathan Stanley. Jonathan is a successful attorney and a passionate advocate for mental health, and he joins us from Florida via Skype. Let's take a look.
I remember when my dad came from his first trip to Broad. He came back and he said, I found my Manhattan Project. He had no particular desire to build a better nuclear weapon, but he did have a desire to put his funds and his ambitions to help solve the riddle of severe mental illness. When I was in college, I came down, or I had the classic break of bipolar illness. And not just bipolar illness, but bipolar illness with psychotic features. So when did my dad decide where the money was going to go? Probably in 1988 when he walked into a New York psychiatric facility and found his beloved son, me, in a straitjacket and completely psychotic. Mental illness had picked a fight. Mental illness had picked to fight the wrong man. So if I have a task for all the incredibly intelligent and wonderfully collaborative people at Broad who are on the cutting edge of both technology and of a method to work together as a team to tackle such a problem, it is to figure out why I could get so sick and get so better, and then make it work for everyone else who falls off the cliff like I did. Thank you.
Mental illness picked a fight with the wrong man. I love it. Thanks so much to Jonathan for joining us, and huge thanks to my esteemed panel. Anyone who wants to know more about this, go to www.broadinstitute.org. And I think the last word should go to the juggernaut in chief, Eric Lander.
Well, thanks so much, Carrie, and thanks to the panel, and especially thanks to Ed Skolnick and to Ted Stanley for kicking this remarkable era off. My message: we can't do this alone. No one individual, no one institution, no one consortium, no one can do this alone. We all have to work together to make this happen. So I ask everybody who's watching and everyone who cares about mental illness in any way to join the fight with whatever you can bring to it. Whether it's your scientific expertise, whether it's patients joining in this fight with scientists, whether it's philanthropists who can help support this at any institution around the world, join in the fight, because together, I am convinced, we will get there.
Psychiatric disorders are important because they're common.
1 in 4 Americans have mental illness.
These are the chronic disorders of young people.
The problem is, we don't really understand the causes of most of these disorders.
The genetic background is very complex.
In order to develop new rational treatments, you have to understand your enemy, if you like.
The human genome is giving us a historical opening in a problem that had seemed closed and intractable for so many years.
The announcement of 108 places in the human genome where there are vulnerabilities for schizophrenia, it just multiplies what we knew by a factor of 10.
For the first time, science is going to really be able to deliver on the promise of understanding the basis of psychiatric disease.
We have remarkable technologies that will allow us to take these genetic discoveries forward.
The data coming from the genetics are going to create the best targets for the best drugs.
The discoveries of the genes now will spawn exactly the same kind of revolution in treatment as we were in cancer research in 1982.
All of a sudden, we have a real platform on which to stand.
Hope is very real now.
What's been going on up in Boston has been particularly exciting. The pace has picked up sharply over the past decade.
This is an unbelievable moment in time for psychiatric research. I can't put into words the hope that this brings for new therapeutics.
What this is really about is coming up with some new answers for patients.
I think that opportunity is going to draw all kinds of people into this field.
We've got a whole new generation of people coming into this field who are well trained, know how to ask difficult questions, and they know how to attack them.
We need neurobiologists, biochemists, molecular biologists, stem cell biologists.
Funding agencies for other philanthropists to really join this battle.
The only way to success is to work together.
The Broad Institute can't do this alone. No scientific group or institute could do this alone.
There's an enormous amount of work left to do, but we're no longer in a dark age.
In the coming years, we're going to see a tremendous revolution in our understanding and eventually treatment of psychiatric disease.